Hi, it's Andrew Marty here from SACS. Welcome everybody, and today's webinar is on the topic of 10 leadership behaviours that affect engagement, and we have titled this Leadership Where Perception is Reality, because one of the things that I think you find in leadership is that it's behaviours that matter, and it's people's perceptions of those behaviours that really drive their levels of engagement. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to take you through a bunch of research, some research that we've conducted and some research which has been conducted internationally, and we're going to provide you with information on the following. We're going to talk about leadership. What is it? Where does it come from? Where does the whole need for leadership arise from? And I'm going to suggest that leadership is an extremely biological characteristic. Leadership exists in amongst a whole bunch of members of the animal kingdom and human beings not least amongst them. We're also going to talk about engagement, and specifically what we're talking about here is leader behaviours that drive engagement. So in order to deal with the topic of which leader behaviours drive engagement, I think we have to deal with the topic of engagement itself, which is to say, what do we mean by engagement and what do we know about engagement? Why does engagement matter? Why is it that organisations all over the world are kind of focused on engagement at the moment? And so we'll take you through some research that shows you A, what we mean by engagement, but B, also what we know about how engagement affects the real world. And then we're going to talk about the 10 behaviours of successful leaders, and we're going to show you which behaviours turn out to be most important. There are 10 that seem to matter, but there are 4 of those that seem to be especially crucial. And then we're going to look at the question of whether these behaviours predict engagement. And so we're going to show you some primary research that we undertook with in partnership with Deakin University, and some results which arose from that. So just before I kick off, I'll do what I always do at the start of these presentations, which is to say that if anybody wants a copy of the slides, you can get that. But we are also recording this webinar so that if anybody, we always get questions or we get requests for people to forward details of the webinar onto other people. And so you can do that. That's no problem at all. Just drop us an email and we will send you a link which will allow you to forward the webinar in recorded form to other people. But as well as that, what we'll be doing is that we'll be making the slides available if people want those. I know that I get told often that people are sitting there taking notes. Feel free to do that. But if the things are on the slide, you'll get the slides. So just talking about leadership generally, we're not talking about leadership in an organisational sense, we're talking about leadership generally. If you go to see, I went to see a client out in the eastern suburbs recently, and there was a lake just beside where this client was, and there was a group of geese, and it was clear that one goose was the leader, because as this goose walked around, the other geese were following it, and not only that, when the goose got alarmed and started honking, the other geese became alarmed. So that goose was clearly the leader of those geese. And if you look at animals, leadership is a characteristic that has evolved in a whole range of different ways. Now, I think that it's important to kind of be aware of the genetic history of leadership and why it evolved, because I think that some of the things that we see in leadership of humans are drawing from the kind of historical past as to where leadership evolved from. So I thought I'd share with you some research into chimpanzees, what causes chimpanzees to rise to positions of leadership. This was in fact research that was conducted by a fellow by the name of Richard Avery from the United States of America, Richard Harvey from the United States of America. And what he did is that for some time it was kind of mysterious as to what caused chimps to be elected. And in fact, I don't know if you know this, but chimps actually have elections for their leaders. They don't have hung parliaments and they don't have secret ballots. Their form of voting is quite open. But what typically happens is the two chimps will fight it out to be leader. And what typically happens is the one that is backed by the most chimps is the one that emerges as leader. And if they are backed by the other chimps, well, that's voting, isn't it? I mean, they've elected that chimp leader. Now, one of the things that's been noticed by biologists for years is that chimps, in fact, it's not always the biggest and strongest chimp that ends up being the boss. And in fact, what Harvey and a couple of other researchers did is they measured a whole bunch of characteristics, including the serotonin levels in the chimp's brains. Now, what they discovered is that the boss chimp was typically a chimp that had high levels of serotonin in their brain. And in fact, if you know what serotonin does, it kind of makes you calm, reasonable, happy, contented. And so, in fact, we were presented, therefore, with the strange proposition that the chimp that kind of gets elected to the boss role is in fact the most reasonable chimp, the most calm chimp, the most kind of, what would you say, the most easy to deal with chimp. And in fact, that seems to be a characteristic. In other words, we look for leaders that are calm and reasonable, and whilst there's got to be an assertiveness there, they're not going to be tyrants. And in fact, that's all very interesting, but then Avi did the same exercise with the presidents of US college fraternities. You know, in the States, they have these clubs called fraternities where people who are at university, they form these clubs and people get elected to those leadership roles. And what they discovered is that the fraternity presidents tended to have higher levels of serotonin than their followers. Also, Avi suggested that if you measure the, what do you call a baby chimp? Is it a chimplet? I like chimplet. I'm not sure that's entirely correct, but let's go with chimplet for the moment. If you measure the levels of serotonin in the chimplet's brain as it's growing up, then that apparently is some kind of a predictor as to whether the chimp is likely to ultimately be the boss chimp. Looking at the photo on the screen, I'm not sure which of these is the boss chimp, but in any event, isn't it interesting that you find something very similar between college fraternity presidents and chimps? And actually, having been to a couple of fraternity meetings in the United States, maybe it's not that kind of unusual after all. But the point is, leadership is a very biological thing. Now, so that's leadership. We're going to come back to some of those biological characteristics, but I also want to talk to you about engagement, because the form of this presentation is to talk about leadership behaviours that drive engagement. So let's agree what we mean by engagement. Now, for many years, in fact, I didn't like to use the term engagement because engagement actually, as a term, belonged mainly to consulting firms. And they all had their own models, like the Gallup model of engagement or the Hay Associates of engagement or the Carnegie and Dell model of engagement. And in fact, it was really only in 2011 that Bakker and his friend and colleague Demaruti wrote an article which sort of united our view as to what we mean by engagement. And what Bakker said is that engagement has three characteristics. Now, he didn't just make this up. He distilled this information from a bunch of research that had taken place by a whole group of researchers across the world. And he said that engagement is three things. First is vigour. In order to be truly engaged, you need to be vigorous and energetic in the way that you go about things. And that also implies high levels of mental resilience. The second is that you need to be dedicated, which means that you're strongly committed to your work, you try hard, your work has a sense of significance for you, you're enthusiastic about your work, you sense that there's a challenge in it. And the signs of dedication are things like I try hard, but it's also maybe I think about this work outside of working hours and I try to get better at what I'm doing. So dedication is a kind of a commitment to what I'm doing. And the third characteristic of engagement is absorption, where people get so drawn into their work that time flies, they don't notice time passing, they feel happy in their work, they're engrossed in their work, and maybe it's a sort of workplace where you look up at the clock and you think, hey, where did that day go to? That says absorption. And you see that we're calling this a group version of flow, and some of you may have heard of the name of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who with his colleague Gene Nakamura came up with the idea of flow in about 2002. Flow is really an idea that at an individual level we can get drawn into doing things to the point where we don't notice that we're doing them, that we're enjoying doing them. And in fact, flow is a good thing because if we do our work in a flow state, at least some of it, we do it very well and we do it effortlessly. But as well as that, people who get into flow states more often tend to be more psychologically well, more resilient, happier, that kind of stuff. So you can see that engagement in the absorption sense is a sort of a group version of flow. So to be truly engaged, you need to be vigorous, you need to be dedicated, you need to be absorbed. Now, they then, Bakker and Demaruti came up with this diagram, which I think is a wonderful description of the nature of engagement and how it works in the real world. And what they said is that work engagement, here where I'm indicating with the cursor, leads to job performance. And there have been multiple studies that show that as work engagement goes up, job performance goes up, both in qualitative and quantitative senses. So as my work engagement goes up, I get through more work, but I also get through work of a better quality than if my work engagement is lower. What we also know is that as work engagement declines, the quality and quantity of work declines. So that's worth knowing. But in addition to that, what they also were able to demonstrate is that the characteristic of being engaged at work is really driven by two things. and they're the resources that we bring to our work. So just to talk about personal resources are things like my intrinsic psychological makeup. So my IQ, how smart I am, is an intrinsic personal resource. My personality is an intrinsic personal resource. My value set is an intrinsic personal resource. And not only that, but things like my skills and my experience and my attitudes and values are personal resources. They're things that belong to me, and I can take them with me when I go from workplace to workplace. But in fact, personal resources are not enough to be highly engaged in your work. What you need is what Bakker and Demariti call job resources, and job resources are in fact not things like cars and offices and telephones and computers. They're in fact psychosocial resources. And what we mean by psychosocial resources, we mean resources to do with the way that we interact with other people. That's what really drives in great engagement in human beings, to do with the way that we interact with other people. So that might be that if we're in a workplace where people are of their own nature engaged in their work, that's a job resource. Also, things like, do I have clarity about what I'm trying to achieve here? Well, yeah, that's a job resource. Is my boss helpful to me? That's a job resource. Is it clear what my organisation is trying to achieve? Are my colleagues helpful, or are they cynical and difficult? Those are all job resources. Now, this model overall is called the job demands and resources model of engagement. So in short, what this means is that if you want people to be highly engaged, you need to ensure that they have both the job resources and the personal resources to ensure that they will be highly engaged, and without those two things they won't. Now, just think about change management for a moment. You know, I find that people undertake change management and they quite often hope that people will change in the way that they want, and they are sometimes disappointed with people's readiness to change. Just imagine the following. I'm asked to do a new job in a new way that I've never done before. I'm used to doing a job in the old way. I wonder if that means that I have either the job or personal resources to do that new job. Because what it says is that if I don't have those job and personal resources, then I'm going to be less engaged in trying to do this. And of course, what do we find when we try to bring about change? We find a decline very often in the level of engagement of staff. They buy out. So I'm going to suggest that if you're undertaking a significant change effort, I think one of the things that you need to reflect on is, have you provided people with the personal and job resources necessary to do this? Now, right now, we do a lot of work in the disability sector, for instance, and right now you've got this change to a thing called National Disability Insurance Scheme. What that means is that those organisations become more commercial. And so my question is twofold. Do people have the personal resources necessary to live and prosper in a post-NDIS world? And I think very often, sadly, the answer is no in an individual case. I'm sure that there are plenty of people who do have the personal resources, the attitudes, the values, the IQ, all of that stuff necessary to compete in a more competitive world. But the second is the job resources. To what degree are we confident that we have trained people and supported them for this brand new world? Anyway, the essence of it is that this model would suggest that if you haven't got both of those things, then people's levels of engagement are going to decline, and therefore they will buy out of the whole proposition. But I think one of the things, so I mentioned this is the job demands and resources model. Let's talk a little bit about demands. Now, if somebody has the right level of job resources and the right level of personal resources, it turns out that an increase in job demands can cause an increase in their work engagement. In other words, as the challenge goes up, I can become more excited, more vigorous, dedicated, and absorbed in my work. But if job demands increase and I don't have the job resources or the personal resources to cope with that, then my work engagement is going to decline. All right, so there is a link, but it's a moderating link between job demands, job resources, and work engagement. Now, of course, when we're talking about job resources, the whole point of this presentation is about leadership behaviours, and leadership is one of the most important resources that any staff member can have. So we'll talk specifically about the sort of leader behaviours that matter in terms of creating the job resources necessary for people to do their job. Now you'll notice that at the bottom here we have this thing called job crafting, and what it's suggesting, the flow of arrows suggests that work engagement causes job performance causes job crafting, but work engagement also directly causes job crafting. What do we mean by job crafting? We mean a situation where highly engaged employees go out of their way to improve things. Job crafting is a situation where spontaneously employees make things better. Now, if you've got a change management environment, of course, this is one of the reasons why people care a lot about engagement, because engagement sponsors job crafting, and so change management therefore is spontaneous rather than having to drag people along or persuade or cajole them. If they're job crafting, they're actually doing what they can to make things better. But it's really important to understand that you don't get job crafting until you have the right levels of work engagement, and work engagement leads to job performance. That plugs into job crafting, but so does work engagement directly. So job crafting is a really important change management tactic, but it's also just a general efficiency tactic, because if people are job crafting, they will make things happen better, smoother, less expensively, all those things that we're looking for. But as well as that, you get an additional benefit from job crafting, because as job crafting plugs into personal resources and job resources, what we're saying here is that if people are job crafting, they actually improve their skills and experience, which gives them greater personal resources, but they also tend to collaborate and work with each other, which gives them better job resources, and in effect this becomes an upward spiral. Job crafting leads to increased resources lead to increased work engagement, that also leads to an increased capacity to deal with job demands, and so around and around goes the cycle. So that's how work engagement can drive an improvement strategy in any organisation, but it's also a way of ensuring that change management and resilience are high. So let's talk about the next stage of this question of engagement, and here's just a very brief summary of the business case for engagement. When people are highly engaged, they tend to be more healthy, both physically and psychologically. They tend to take broader perspectives and more creativity. They're prepared to consider things that otherwise they wouldn't. Engaged employees tend to create their own resources rather than sitting around waiting for people to solve their problems for them. Work performance, I mentioned earlier, increases and decreases with engagement. Discretionary effort, if people are highly engaged, you get more discretionary effort. OH&S outcomes, we know that engaged work groups are safer, you get lower levels of injuries in engaged work groups. But as well as that, engagement is contagious. As it goes up, it tends to communicate itself to other employees and stakeholders. So there's a number of really good things that engagement gives you. It also gives you things like lower staff turnover, lower absenteeism, those kind of things. So last year we undertook this very big study with Deakin University, and thanks to Simon Albrecht and Emil Bridal from Deakin University for participating in this project. Simon's the senior lecturer who managed the Deakin component of this project. And so what we did is we measured a whole bunch of things about engagement and its drivers in workforces. And I thought I'd show you some of the stuff. This is the sort of stuff that I like to see, because there's some interesting findings here, and so interesting findings in terms of how different sectors perform in engagement. So firstly, this is the study, and we got in excess of 2,600 people who responded to this study, which I haven't really checked deeply, but I think this is one of the biggest studies in work engagement in Australia's history. 2,600 is a big number of people to assess in this way and to measure in this way. The other thing about it is one of the reasons why universities like to partner with us is these people were all employees in organisations, in other words, doing real-life jobs. Anybody who's ever read any psychological research will know that the most common species measured by psychological research is undergraduatus vulgaris, which means that a lot of research in psychology is done with undergraduate students because they're easy to get. But of course, if you're going to study work engagement, it's best if you get real-life employees doing real-life jobs. So because we asked these people a bunch of demographic questions as well as the questions about engagement, we were able to ask the question, does engagement vary by industry? Fascinating question. And so here's the answer. Now, you'll see that up the top here we have Utrecht Work Engagement Scale. The Utrecht Work Engagement Scale is an internationally recognised scale which measures engagement. We use this thing in order to be able to have what in science we call a criterion variable, which was a validated criterion variable, and so the Utrecht Work Engagement Scale is what we used. Now what you see is that the most engaged workforce in Australia is health services. This also includes things like disability and aged care. So health services is the most engaged with an average of 4.41, and you see that, okay, you get a decline across various sectors. Primary industries, I tell you what, there's nothing like standing around looking after moo cows to make you engaged, because primary industries, which is dairy and farming and all of those sorts of things, yeah, they're pretty engaged. Local government is very engaged, which is interesting. And I think, well, we'll talk about the comparison of local government with state government, which, as you can see, is right down here. I suspect that the difference there is that local government is more client-facing, and so the satisfaction factors are closer to the person in local government than they are in state government, but there could be other reasons. Professional services, that's us. We're a pretty engaged kind of a crew. When you get to the middle, manufacturing, construction and trade, they're doing pretty well. It's tough times in those sectors, so they're bearing up pretty well. Arts, media and communications, utilities just at the lower end, other services, state government, as I mentioned. But the worst sector in Australia from an engagement point of view is fast-moving consumables. And what do we mean by fast-moving consumables? Well, we mean chips and lollies and cans of fizzy drink, snacks generally. You know, the things that when you check out at the supermarket, the things are actually right on the counter. That's fast-moving consumer goods. It's not all fast-moving consumer goods, but I don't know why, but fast-moving consumer goods appears to be the least engaged workforce in Australia. Interesting. So another really interesting question, does engagement vary with age? Well, in fact, it does, and quite markedly. So younger people, and I'm over 50, so I love this slide, but if younger people are, in fact, much less engaged than older people. Now, I once showed this to a group of young people, and I said, well, what do you think's going on there? And the young people said, well, we've got better things to do than being engaged with our work, maybe. I think that there's some potential explanations to this. One of them is that I think that when you get to 51 or older, you've found a career. I mean, I hope you have, because, you know, if you're 30 and you're sort of just starting out in your career, or 25, you're probably still experimenting with your career and you're trying to find what you want. The 51-year-olds should have found what they want. The other thing is that maybe 50-year-old plus people they're more engaged in their work because they appreciate it more. I mean, if you're 30 or 25, it's not that hard to get a new job, but maybe if you're 55, people appreciate their work more because they know a lot of people who don't have work, possibly. Does engagement vary with salary? Well, yeah, it does. And in fact, I think that here is a very, very interesting thing. And what I'm going to say is that I think this relates to the 10 leader behaviours that we're going to talk about, because what it shows you is that the Utrecht work engagement style demonstrates quite clearly that if you are lowly paid, 0 to 20,000, so that's mainly part-timers, I would guess, or 20 to 50 or 50 to 70, you're actually quite highly engaged. But look at this, from 70 to 150, you are very disengaged. And so what that means is that we have a very sad crew of middle managers in Australia. Fascinating. I think that I'm going to show you when we get to the leader behaviours, I think there are some reasons why these people are so disengaged. And I think the answer is that they're kind of the meat in the sandwich. So they're not really client-facing, which is what these guys are, and they're not really making the strategy, which is what these guys are. They're sort of trapped in the middle. They're taking the messages from these higher-ups and passing them on to these lower-level people. And so maybe that means that they feel a bit pressurised and perhaps even a bit disempowered. But we will come back to that topic. Anyway, I think that's a really interesting survey result, or a really interesting science result, because I haven't seen previously such comprehensive data that demonstrates this hole in the heart of Australian organisations. I think the other thing I would say about that is that it says, gee, we've got an opportunity of setting some talent free in that middle management rank. Does engagement vary by education level? A bit, you know, and I guess low, high, the medium bachelor degree a bit less. I mean, these are statistically significant differences. And because I like to go straight to the controversial stuff, does engagement vary between men and women? And the answer is, in fact, no, or not statistically significantly different. And given that we've got 2,600 people, if there was a difference that even had a relatively small magnitude, it would have been statistically significant, because that's the way statistics works. The bigger the sample, the more likely it is to be significant. So isn't that interesting? Men and women, really, we couldn't find a statistically significant difference between their levels of engagement. So now we get to the point about what causes engagement. And so this is where leader behaviours fit in. But before we get to leader behaviours, we have to look at the broader context of what causes engagement. There's a range of things. And I think that, to summarise it, it would be fair to say that engagement is caused by a mix of nature and nurture. So engagement drives the quality and quantity of work that people do, and it drives the quality and quantity of relationships that people have at work. On the nature side of the equation, we're going to talk about things like IQ, cognitive ability, aptitudes, the three names that are most often given to intelligence. Now, let's say between 70 and 80% genetically determined, tend not to change much over the course of life. Integrity and trustworthiness, so the tendency to undertake counterproductive and other negative behaviours, has a very strong genetic component to it. I know that can surprise people, but there is very strong research evidence to that effect. So that will drive people's ability to be engaged, and it'll drive the engagement of people around you too, because if you're acting in a low integrity, counterproductive kind of a fashion, then the people around you will have lower levels of engagement. But as well as that, personality is a big driver of engagement. And we know that if a person's personality is a certain way, then they're way more likely to be engaged than if they don't have those personality characteristics. And we'll show you what those are. But once you have the nature component, then the nurture component is things like our skills, our experience, the attributes, the style and attitudes and values of ourselves and people around us, but it's also most critically the behaviours of people around us. That's what will drive people's levels of engagement. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but this is personality. This is a thing called the hexaco model of personality. People who use our psychological assessment service will know that we strongly advocate the hexaco model of personality. 6 factors: H for honesty, humility, E for emotionality, X for extroversion, A for agreeableness, C for conscientiousness, O for openness to experience. That's all I'm going to tell you today, because that's not really crucial to this whole discussion. But I'm also going to talk to you about values. Sorry, just to go back briefly to personality. Personality is also something that has a very strong genetic component, probably, I think, about 60 to 70%. Other people will say as low as 50, but we all agree that there's a very strong genetic component. But then there's a person's values, and once more, I don't want to go through these 10 values in detail. There are a number of presentations which do this, but a person's values are not heavily genetically determined. They tend to be learned in the course of a person's life, and those values tend to vary quite markedly from country to country. So if I grew up in Spain versus growing up in West Footscray, I'm going to have very different values, one from the other. And Shalom Schwartz, who's the developer and discoverer of this model of values through measuring literally millions of people across the world, he has been able to demonstrate that you get very big values differences from country to country, but also he's also been able to demonstrate that values can change in the course of a person's life. So security, which means I want to be safe and I want those I care about to be safe, that actually varies quite markedly during the course of the average person's life. Younger people are not very security conscious. Older people are security conscious. You can't say that about personality. Personality doesn't tend to migrate in that way. So the proposition is, I'm going to show you a piece of research. This is not the Deakin piece of research. This was a piece of research that we did separately. We measured the levels of engagement of many people. This was, in fact, 800 people, so not quite at 2,600, but 800's a pretty big sample. And so we measured the levels of engagement of these people, and then we went and hunted out the psych details of some of these people. So we measured more than 800. We measured a couple of thousand, but we discovered that we had psych tests on 800 of them. And what we did is we looked at their scores from a personality point of view, and we looked at their scores from a values point of view. I know this kind of looks scientific. Simple enough to say what we were doing is we were mathematically asking the question whether, if we know a person's personality and values, we could predict their levels of engagement, measured at 2 separate times. Engagement measured quite separately from personality and values. Now, mathematically, the answer is yes, you can, because what this shows, firstly, it shows a multiple correlation of 0.585. Those of you who know correlational research would know that's a pretty strong correlation. But this adjusted R-squared, you could regard this as kind of like a percentage accuracy figure. And what it means is that we were able to predict people's levels of engagement with 30% accuracy if we knew their personality and values. Now, that's totally regardless of where they're working. I mean, we know that a person's workplace is going to drive their engagement, but what we're saying here is that irrespective of how they're being led, we can predict their levels of engagement with 30% accuracy if we know these intrinsic psychological characteristics. How good is 30%? Well, let me put it this way. The average reference check is accurate to the tune of 7%, and the average interview is accurate to the tune of 12%. So I think 30% is pretty good. Now, what we also know is that there are characteristics. It tells us the characteristics that are the key drivers of engagement. These beta weights are really just measures of strength of prediction. And what it shows you is that diligent, hard-working people are more likely to be engaged. It tells you that lively people are likely to be engaged. Lively means optimistic, cheerful, positive, and that shouldn't be a surprise because this fits in the category of positive emotions. You also see greedy people are unlikely to be engaged. So greed avoidance, which is the opposite of being greedy, causes engagement. Conformity, people who have the characteristic, the value of conformity, which is here, that value is all about wanting to be part of a team and wanting to fit in. That drives engagement and so forth. So anyway, I guess what we're saying is that it is possible to psych test your way into higher levels of engagement. I mean, I suppose the question is, we actually predict engagement for people who psych test through us. Everybody, you can access a prediction of engagement, and you could theoretically increase the levels of engagement in your workforce by 30% just by psych testing, and that's worth doing. Now, talking about the other components of engagement. So putting the nature side to one side, let's talk about nurture. And what we have here is 4 drivers of engagement. This was, we were helped enormously here by Emil Bridle, who went and did the literature review about the key drivers from a bunch of different pieces of research about the things that drive engagement. And what he discovered is that there are job characteristics that drive engagement. There are team characteristics that drive engagement. There are leader characteristics, and this is starting, you see now the 10 things that we measured in leader characteristics, and then there are organisational characteristics. So once more, we did this great big multiple regression study, but this time much larger numbers. So you remember that we had 2,600 people respond to this particular project. And what we found is job, team, leader, organisation across the board. All right. Now, what we're doing here is that we're predicting people's levels of engagement from their responses about optimism about my job, which means I think my job's going to get better. Variety work. Have I got variety work? Have I got self-confidence? So the answer is yes, you can predict. I mean, any time a correlation gets up to 0.8, that's a really big correlation. But look at this. We were able to account for 64% of the variance in engagement from all of these characteristics, which is just massive. That's a really, really big outcome. Let me tell you some really interesting things that we find here, though, is because what we're finding here is that we're finding, you see, J means job. So number one characteristic, learning at work, means I'm actually improving my skills at work. Optimism about my job. Self-confidence about my job. Variety of work. These 4 are the 4 best predictors of whether somebody is likely to be engaged in their work. So what it says is that my job is a really, really important thing to me. Then leadership characteristic creates a learning environment, which is this one here. That's also one of the best predictors of creating engagement. So if I've got a leader who causes me to learn, that's helpful. Optimism in my team, clarity of goals in my team, recognition of performance in my team. So the team characteristics have a big drive on people's levels of engagement. So this is an absolutely crucial truth about engagement, and this has been demonstrated by a bunch of researchers. And what I'm going to tell you is that if you're going to try and fix things about your engagement at an organisational level, it's not going to have much impact because it's not here. All right? So I think the thing that we have to understand is that if you look at where engagement comes from, it comes from local things that are close to me much more than it comes from distant things, things that are distant and far away from me. So if you want to bring about organisational improvement methods, unless you reach into the teams, the jobs and the leaders, you're not going to have much impact. And in particular, I'm going to show you that, because you think, oh, well, look, we haven't got many leadership characteristics. I'm going to show you a mathematical model later on which shows you that the main drivers of team and job are in fact leaders. So yeah, you only get one L here, but the reason for that is that the leader behaviours cause the team behaviours, and they also cause things like, to what degree am I optimistic about my job? To what degree am I getting variety of work? Well, if I'm getting variety of work, my leader is giving me that. If I've self-confidence, well, leadership has a massive impact on that. Learning at work, well, clearly if I've got a leader that creates a learning environment that causes me to learn at work. So the equation is as follows. Leader behaviours cause team and job characteristics to work to drive engagement. And that's, incidentally, you see the absence of O's for organisations here. That's why mission, vision, values, activities almost never work, because they are working at the corporate level, and the corporate level is a long way away from the employee, whereas things that are operating at my job and my team level and my leader level, those are the things that will really make a change to me. So I want to talk a bit about, so we're getting specific about leader behaviours now. I want to talk to you about the research of a guy by the name of Kim Cameron, positive behaviours in leaders. Kim Cameron's a positive psychologist, and in 2012 with two other guys by the name of Owens and Baker in the United States of America, he did a very interesting study. He measured what he called the positive energy of unit leaders. Unit leaders being people who lead teams. Now, I'm not sure I like positive energy as a term, because that sort of sounds a little bit metaphysical, and I'm maybe just a little bit too skeptical to like terms like positive energy. I would have called it positive behaviours, because what they measured were the degrees to which leaders were helpful, supportive, the degree to which they were optimistic, the degrees to which they were focused on the future, the degree to which they were enthusiastic, all to do with positive behaviours, I believe. They found a couple of things that you would predict straight away. I mean, yeah, it plugs into engagement. More positive the leader, and this is what we found as well, the more engaged staff, the greater the levels of job satisfaction, the greater levels of personal well-being. If I'm being led by somebody who's positive, not any surprise at all that I'm going to have higher levels of well-being. And performance, he found that when you have a positive leader, you do a better job. But this, I think, is a little bit spooky, because what he did is that he measured the levels of engagement of staff, and he measured the positive energy of unit leaders. But what he discovered is that he could predict, and in fact I think the correlation from memory is about 0.35 or something like that, which is far from nothing. He found a correlation between the well-being of families and the positive behaviours of unit leaders. Now just think about that for a moment. Chances are these family members have never even met this leader, yet you have a situation where the leader's behaviours are affecting the well-being of families, even though those family members have never had personal contact with the unit leaders. So what's going on there? I guess what we see is that where leaders are behaving positively, what they're doing is that they are cascading positive vibes into the staff, who either go home and kick the dog, or they go home and they are happy, motivated, calm, all of those sorts of things. So in effect, you're seeing an emotional contagion through the contact of the staff with their own families. Fascinating stuff, really. Really interesting study to show that, well, in fact, I guess what it means is that leadership is a pretty scary caper, really, because if you're going to accidentally affect the well-being of families that you've never even met, that makes leadership pretty responsible, doesn't it? So out of this research, we constructed what we call a leadership behaviour scale to measure the 10 most important characteristics. But firstly, I'm going to show you the direct impact of leaders onto engagement. So we found that job characteristics and organisational characteristics and all those other things I had in the previous slide affect people's levels of engagement. But can you predict a staff member's level of engagement with any accuracy at all if you happen to know whether their leader is creating a learning environment and doing all of these things? And the answer is yes. You can predict it with about, let's say, 25% accuracy. Now, the power of leaders is more powerful than that, because they're affecting the job characteristics and they're affecting the team characteristics. But let's talk through the leader behaviours that we found to come out and significantly contribute to levels of engagement. The first here is creates a learning environment. So what it means is that one of the most crucial behaviours that leaders can undertake is to create an environment where people improve their skills, where they improve their attributes, where they improve their attitudes, their values. If I am learning at work, I am likely to be much more highly engaged than if I'm not learning at work. So that's characteristic number one. Now let me just emphasise that sometimes when I'm talking through this particular thing about creating a learning environment, people would say, well, I'd love to, but we don't have a learning budget. This is nothing to do with sending people on courses. And there's a thing called the 80-20 rule in adult learning that says when you're doing a job, you learn 80% of the useful stuff actually on the job. So it's more like, is this leader trying to sponsor mentoring type arrangements? Is the leader a good coach personally? Does the leader encourage staff to work together to learn from each other? That's what we mean by creating a learning environment. The second component is about being supportive. And here we're talking about the characteristic of being kind, helpful, polite, nice to people. So leaders who are positive and respectful in their personal interactions with people, that's the important thing. Then we talk about fostering teamwork. Fostering teamwork really says, I cause people to work together. A good leader is somebody who doesn't lead purely individualistically, doesn't say, Mary do this, Bill do this, Jane do this. It's a leader who actually says, Mary, Bill and Jane, let's get together and solve this problem. That's the way that you foster teamwork. You bring people together to work on stuff, to solve problems, to do projects, whatever. Encourages autonomous decision-making. Now, why did we use this terminology? We're really saying, look, I think that this has turned into a cliche by the name of empowerment. And when people use the term empowerment, I think that they're really talking in a very conceptual sense. Let me tell you, the leader behaviour here is that I encourage my staff to make decisions that affect their work. I encourage them to do that. That's what we're talking about, not some airy-fairy attitude or idea about empowerment. You're actually causing them and encouraging them, and not only that, you're coaching them to make important decisions. And that's one of the things that will build skills, but also free up my time as a leader to do strategic stuff as well as the face-to-face leadership stuff. Effective management of behaviours. What we're talking about here is where leaders respond appropriately when people demonstrate behaviours which are not optimum. To have an optimum corporate culture, you can't have a laissez-faire attitude to people's behaviours. People want to work in an environment which is safe, and they want to work in an environment which they're proud of, and without effective management of behaviours, you can't have that. But as well as that, you need to have effective management of underperformance. And effective management of underperformance means if somebody's underperforming, I am going to redirect their behaviours so that they get back on track in terms of achieving what needs to be achieved. Celebrating success appears to be an important leadership behaviour, but that's, everybody knows what that means. Hey, John, you did a great job. Let's all get together and have a cup of tea and a cake because we achieved this project, whatever. Optimism and positivity. So good leaders, and this is one of my pet beefs about many leadership development programs, because most leadership development programs never even mention the fact that leaders need to be optimistic and positive. And let me tell you that if we go back to the animals, you saw a slide of chimps before, if you think of why people, animals as well as people, why leadership evolved. I asked this in a workshop yesterday and everybody said survival. Well, that's dead right. Leadership evolves for survival. Now just think of this. Imagine you're a chimp and you're thinking of following a chimp. Are you really going to follow a chimp which says, well, look, I don't know whether we'll get a feed tomorrow? Look, I think that there's every chance that we'll get beaten up by this other chimp group. We could go north, but I'm just not sure whether there's water there or not. That's not optimism and positivity. People need to see optimism and positivity and a future focus in their leaders in order to be able to want to follow them. And I think that's the true definition of leadership. And in a psychological sense, a leader is a person that people want to follow, and optimism and positivity is a driver of that. In the Kim Cameron slide that I showed you earlier, the word heliotropic was there. Heliotropic means where people turn towards, in biology, a heliotropic flower is one that turns towards the sun. This has been applied to leadership because a heliotropic leader is somebody who exudes positive attitudes and behaviours, and people turn towards that person. They want to follow them. Now, I talked about effective management of behaviours, but as well as that, of course, before you start managing it, you need to create clarity about appropriate behaviours. Now, you might say, well, surely if somebody's exhibiting clarity about behaviours, they're also managing them. No. We 360-degree feedback using this instrument. We 360-degree feedback many, many people. And we often find that people can be fantastic at clarity but terrible at management, or fantastic at management and terrible at clarity, because ideally what you want them to do is be good at both. But of course, performance standards as well. The effective management of underperformance, but of also creating clarity of performance standards. So those are the 10 behaviours of effective leaders. Now, what you see here is the best predictors of engagement, and this in effect means these are the 4 kings or queens, depending on your orientation, or perhaps popes for that matter. But these are the most powerful drivers of engagement in terms of leadership behaviours. And the first one
is encourages autonomous decision making. You notice that it's got the biggest beta weight by a long way. What that says is that if leaders want highly engaged staff, the most important thing that they can do is to go in and encourage people to say, look, this is a decision, you make it. And you can lead people up to this by saying, all right, don't come to me with just problems. Come to me with suggestions about what you'd like to do. But encouraging people to make their own decisions, I'll use the vexed slogan word, empowerment. Empowering people is the single most powerful thing that you can do to cause people to be highly engaged. The second most powerful, and this is my beef with leadership development courses, the second most powerful is just simply being optimistic and positive. So if I'm a cynical, disconnected, negative, pessimistic leader, forget it. I can do everything else that's right, but I'm really not going to have any success as a leader. The third is about being supportive. And supportive leaders are the ones that are kind, helpful, causing people to feel that they belong, causing people to feel that they're valued, supportive leadership. And the fourth most powerful is creating a learning environment. And in fact, I think that, I mentioned earlier, this is not sending in people on courses, but the best way of causing people to learn at work is to cause them to get involved in something where they're actually improving something. Let's get together and solve a problem. Let's get together and fix something. Let's get together and make the world a better place. So engagement is caused by these 10 behaviours, but 4 of them are really crucial. And in fact, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, when you measure the levels of engagement in workforces, we're finding that we pretty much can predict their levels of engagement by the 360-degree feedback. We often follow on from a climate survey using this tool to measure these levels of engagement, and it's amazing the relationships that we see between them. The other thing that we often do at the moment, and we're doing a number of projects associated with this, is where we psych test people and then we look at the 360-degree feedback at the same time, and we do a debrief where they get a development plan based on their psych results and their 360-degree feedback. In fact, I'll tell you a little game that I like to do. Don't tell anybody about this, it's just my secret. The game is as follows. What I do is I get a person's psychs and then I try to predict what their 360-degree feedback is going to look like. And you know what? I would modestly claim that I'm right way more often than I'm wrong. And the reason is that in particular a person's personality, and sometimes their IQ, a person's personality drives their behaviours, and that's what you're seeing in 360-degree feedback. Now, that doesn't mean that a person can't change those behaviours, and we know that when a person becomes aware of the personality drivers that are driving their behaviours, they can actually modify those behaviours somewhat. It's much more powerful than just looking at the behaviours themselves, although that of itself is developmental. Now, this is a little bit of mathematics, and I have simplified this somewhat, but what we're saying is that if you look at leader behaviours drive colleague behaviours, and by colleague behaviours we're putting 2 things in here. It's the behaviour of team members and it's the behaviour of people towards their jobs. So you're getting a correlation of nearly 0.8 from how leader behaviours drive colleague behaviours, and you'll notice that we've got another correlation of 0.8 which is getting into engagement. And so in effect you see that there's a direct path. Now for mathematical reasons this path goes negative, don't worry too much about that. What we're really saying here is that the real strong power of leaders is that leaders infect the psychosocial climate with either positivity or negativity, and that means that each employee lives in that psychosocial environment, they're surrounded by it, and it's the colleague behaviours, the psychosocial aspects of their job and their team that will drive their levels of engagement, and what that will mean is people's engagement is affected in this indirect way, and directly of course, but the indirect way is more powerful to drive engagement. Interesting stuff. Publication in that. I'll certainly be talking further to our academic colleagues about seeing if they can get a publication up in that respect. So 360-degree feedback questions. What we're doing here is we're just showing you the questions that we use in the measure that drives these engagement scores. And so this is a 360-degree feedback tool that we're using for a range of different clients. So things like X, as in Bill Blogs, creates a learning environment for staff, good at helping staff to learn, tries to help staff to acquire skills and knowledge. Now, these CFA scores, I'm really just putting these down just to show, actually I'm pretty proud of them really, because what this means, these are what are called factor scores. This stands for confirmatory factor analysis, and these are factor loadings of 0.9, 0.94, 0.943, 0.89, 0.9. Anyway, these are very high factor loadings. Why should you worry about that? Well, probably you won't worry about it unless you're into stats, but what it means is that we can measure something very accurately with very few questions. That's one of the key drivers. The other thing is that it means that this thing is very reliable, because it means that these questions about autonomous decision making, what that means is that they're measuring that particular dimension very accurately. That's what those factor scores say. But in a practical sense, I think what it means is that for many of our clients, we're measuring 10 crucial leadership behaviours and we're only asking 30 questions. And that makes it easy for people to fill this thing in. So talking about some leadership behaviours, I just thought I'd pull out a couple of findings about leadership behaviours, because again, we measure these leadership behaviours across these 2,600 people. And what we found is that the leadership behaviours in health services were perceived by people to be better than fast-moving consumer goods. And guess what? I mean, there's a pretty strong relationship, isn't there, in some of these things, but particularly we're talking about clarity of appropriate behaviours. So, you know, when you see the press on the health sector, you might think, well, nobody behaves well in press. I mean, they have some spectacular examples of where people have behaved badly, but in fact what this suggests is that people in health services actually have leaders who are pretty principled about about the right behaviours. Primary industries are pretty focused on this. And what's really interesting though is look at where local government is. You remember that local government was in fact I think the second most engaged or the third most engaged workforce in terms of overall engagement. Imagine where it would be if leaders were able to create clarity about appropriate behaviours. Really interesting. State government is in fact not great at it either, which suggests that maybe there's a bit of an accountability for behaviours gap in those two sectors. You see professional services pretty high, manufacturing, construction and trade, the lower ones are the state government, local government and fast-moving consumer goods. And arts, media and communications is also not great. But once more, fast-moving consumer goods, crikey, I mean, you know, that's, again, a pretty significant drop-off. So, yeah, I actually presented this a couple of weeks ago and somebody came up to me and said, well, I've worked in fast-moving consumer goods and I'm not surprised. I of course, don't draw any conclusions from that. I'm totally non-partisan when it comes to that kind of thing. How about supportiveness of leadership? You know what? Women perceive their leaders to be more supportive. I mean, this is a statistically significant difference, not a massive difference, but women perceive their leaders to be more supportive than men. I don't know what you make of that, but interesting. And here's just an example of a 360-degree feedback report. So the way it works is that when you put somebody through one of these, so this is based on the instrument that we have developed, and so it creates a learning environment. You see you got an overall score of 59. What that means is that this score is higher than 59% of people who ever completed it. What you see here is that the self, the person who's rated themselves, they've completed 3 questions saying, hey, look, I'm fantastic at this. Sadly, the peers don't really agree because their peers are scoring 37 against, 50 is population average. So 99 to 37 is quite a big difference. You see there's also a bit of a difference here with the direct and indirect reports. The staff don't really think that this person's great. Well, 65 is not that bad, I don't suppose, but you know, there's a bit of a difference there in terms of the overall results. And the manager thinks the person's really good. So they're obviously much more in agreement. The peers have got a little bit of a problem with this person's creating of a learning environment. And so there's space to write comments, and you can see these comments are written in Latin, which is just a way of filling the gap. Most of our people who fill in the comments don't, in fact, fill them in Latin. The other thing that you can do is that you can get a group result, and I love group results on 360-degree feedback. I think that's an incredibly useful learning thing for any organisation. Imagine if you had these 10 leadership characteristics which can be shown to drive engagement. Imagine if you knew, on average, how your leaders compared with population average. So you can see here, good news. This organisation pulls its data together, and on the question of creates a learning environment, you know, we're at 71st percentile, so we're considerably better than population average. What you see here, though, is you do see some differences. So the selves all think they're good at it. That's probably not that surprising. The staff think they're good at it. The managers tend to think that they're good at it. But you know what? The peers are not so sure. And what that would suggest is that, at least on this, the peer-to-peer relationship is not as strong as the relationship between staff member and the leader that they have. And in fact, we find this sometimes where you'll find this right across the board, that you'll have a certain category that's either particularly high or particularly low. And if this was consistent across a number of raters and a number of categories and a number of different one of these questions, so let's say across all 10 areas, then you'd say, all right, well, we've got some work to do in the peer-to-peer relationships then, because the 360-degree feedback being lower in this category suggests that maybe the peers aren't getting on that well. So just to summarise, what do we cover today? We covered the fact that, all right, we talked about leadership. What is leadership? Leadership is a biological characteristic. Human beings are social primates. We need leaders. We talked about the fact that good leaders are optimistic and positive and calm and future-focused, but there are other characteristics, like they've got to create clarity from a learning point of view. They've got to create a situation in which people are aware of what kind of behaviours are appropriate. They've got to be the sort of people who are able to create an understanding amongst their colleagues of how to collaborate. They've got to be the sort of people who create a learning environment. So 10 characteristics which drive engagement. So as I mentioned earlier, if anybody wants copies of this presentation, drop us an email. You will be sent a feedback request, so you'll have the opportunity to do that. And may all of your leaders be heliotropic. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.